It's time for the last thematic upgrade video for all these precons for Deadly Disguise. Now, the theme of this deck is to play your creatures face down using a lot of the new disguise mechanic as well as the old morph mechanic and any kind of things with manifest and the new cloak mechanic attached to disguise that comes in Murders at Karlov Manor. So let's take a look at this deck now and see what the new stuff is and what we're going to be taking out and adding to the deck as well. To start this deck off, we're going to look at the commander that comes at the face, and we're going to leave him at the front too, and that is Kaust, Eyes of the Glade. It's a Dryad Detective 2/2 that whenever a creature you control that was turned face up this turn deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and has an activated ability of tap it, turn target face down, attacking creature you control face up. So this has a couple of functions for us. We can either use it to turn up something up with its own thing, but then again, if it has some kind of like you have to pay additional to get things out of it, and we'll talk about some cards that this does not work really well with in a little bit, then you're not going to get those special effects. But this does give you a free shot at turning a morph that costs a bunch of mana, like 6-7 mana to flip it up on its front face. Instead, you get to do it for just tapping and activating this. And then if you sneak one through where you have a 2/2 that got through and your opponent didn't block it, or you have a way to make them unblockable or whatever, before combat damage is dealt, you use the activated ability, flip them over, smack them, and you get the card draw trigger off of this because you use this to turn it over. Or inversely, if you go ahead and just pay their morph cost or their disguise cost or whatever, and then you flip it over, then you can go ahead and hit them, and it's just, good times and card draw for us. The alternate commander for this deck is Duskana the Rage Mother. For 2, a red, a green, and a white, you get a 5/5 bear that says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature you control with base power toughness 2/2. And whenever a creature you control with base power and toughness 2/2 attacks, it gets +3/+3 until end of turn. So all the morphs, all the disguise cards, the manifested cards, all these things come out as 2/2s by default, and a lot of the creatures in the deck that aren't just, these morphs also count as being 2/2s as well. And it's just a funny in-joke because it's 2/2 is what you call a grizzly bear. So this is a bear commander for the grizzly bears of Magic. So they're going to get +3/+3 if as long as they're a 2/2. So this also gives the +3/+3 because it's an attack trigger. So you can swing with the morph. It hits the +3/+3 trigger, becomes a 5/5, and then you can flip it over to its other side, either using Kaust, or you can use its own morph or disguise ability to flip itself back up, and it still gets the +3/+3 bonus until the end of the turn because that attack part has already passed, and then you can go ahead and smack them around. You can also use this as a way to surprise attack into somebody's blockers, and they're like, oh, well, I'm going to block your guy and kill it, and then even because if they might have like a 6/6 or something like that, and then you flip it over and all of a sudden your guy's like a 7/7, 8/8, whatever, and they lose their guy and you don't. Either way, I don't think you could go wrong putting Duskana at the front of this deck over Kaust, but I think she could use a little more of a dedicated deck design, so I'm going to save her for something else in the future and just keep Kaust at the front instead for this upgrade. So what else are they including here? Well, obviously they're going to be including some disguise cards, hence the name of the deck, Deadly Disguise. So let's take a look at those cards now, starting with Bolt Bender. For 3 and a red, it's a 4/2 Goblin Wizard with Disguise. It can be played face down for 3 as a 2/2 with Ward 2, and then you can pay 1 and a red to flip it up. When it's turned faced up, you may choose new targets for any number of other spells and or abilities. So of course, this is great for any kind of spells, like if somebody copied a spell and started targeting multiple things. It's also really good for just, a single target spell that you really can't afford to have your stuff hit yours, or, a big burn spell coming for your face or whatever. But the ultimate in hilarity here would be to reroute a bunch of targets off of something like, say, Urgent Necropsy off the new set, or a Casualties of War, or any kind of thing like that. If you're able to flip this up and divert multiple targets off of this thing, that is just the best thing ever, especially if you're the one getting picked on in a game and they're blowing up all of your stuff. You can turn around and just reroute and be like, no, all of your stuff is getting blown up instead. The next new card included in the Precon makes you kind of question what happened to experiments 2 through 11, since we started with experiment 1 and now we're up to experiment 12. For 3 and a green, you get a 4/4 Elf Lizard Warrior with Trample that says whenever it or another creature you control is turned face up, put +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to its power, and the disguise cost is 4 and a green. So at face value, experiment 12 is going to turn into an 8/8 if you flip it up for its disguise cost, because it's a 4/4 and it puts 4 counters on itself. But the cool combat trick here is to have Duskana on the board if you're going to have her up front, or just have her out of the 99 on the board. Because then you attack with this as a 2/2, it gets +3/+3, and then it flips over, and it's a 7/7 when this flips over, and it puts 7 counters on it and turns itself into a base 11/11 with those counters on there. So that's really fun. And then anything else that you flip over just buffs itself up with +1/+1 counters as well. So this is a very powerful card in this deck, and I would not think of ever removing it from this particular build. Then there's a 2/2 that stays a 2/2 even when it's disguised or face up. It's Nervous Gardener. For 1 and a green, you get a 2/2 Dryad with disguise of a green. When it is turned face up, search your library for a land card with a basic land type, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. So the nice part here is it's not a basic land, it's just a land with a basic land type. So you can go get shock lands, you can get the brand new Surveil lands, you can get any of the things, triomes, anything that's got a basic land typing on it, this card can actually go get it, put it in your hand, and fix your mana. So if you're running something like Jetmir's Garden in here, if you wanted that, or if you wanted to run any of the shocks like I mentioned, you can just go get them and put them in your hand, and you'll have a dual color or a triple color fix in the case of the triomes if you're running those. And it's just a really good card. Then we have another green card that looks at anything getting turned face up, including itself. That is Print Lifter Ooze. For 1 and a green, it's a 2/2 ooze with Death Touch. When it or another creature is turned face up, create a 0/0 green ooze creature token with trample. The token enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of other creatures you control. Now, this one doesn't look at your power unlike the Experiment 12, but this one actually looks at how many creatures you already have on the board and increases the counters based on that. And its disguise cost is 3 and a green. So it's not too bad. It's basically a 4 flip. So you can flip it the very next turn after you've put it down face down. And it scales with how long the game's going a little better than some cards, because it's like, okay, you keep pumping out creatures onto the board, playing morphs and all this stuff, and eventually you're going to be able to get a big bunch of oozes when this thing flips over, or any of your other stuff starts getting flipped over in mass. Then comes the card where I got the thumbnail for this video. It's Show-Stopping Surprise. For 3 red, it's an instant. Choose target creature you control. Turn it face up if it's face down. Then it deals damage equal to its power to each other creature. So this is kind of a conditional board wipe of sorts for us to put into the deck, because then you flip up, one of your creatures and you can blast everything, and you can kind of choose your own adventure here a little bit. You can go, okay, I only need 2 damage to nuke a bunch of tokens, so you find one of your things that flip over into a 2/2, like the Gardener that we looked at just a little bit ago, and you deal 2 damage to everything. Yes, that'll still kill your other morphs, but anything that was already turned face up that's got a bigger body than 2 on it will survive. And then maybe you just really need everything to go away, so you pick something like Experiment 12, you flip it up using this, it becomes an 8/8 and then deals 8 to everything, and then it blows up the entire board probably. So all in all, you get some functionality here that's very flexible for the deck, but at the same time, it also gives you power to flip up something for free as well. Then we have Unexplained Absence. For 3 and a white, you get an instant. For each player, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls. For each permanent exile this way, its controller cloaks the top card of their library. Now, cloaking was added in along with the disguise mechanic. It is very similar to Manifest, but instead it instructs you where you're going to be cloaking from. It's not, from your hand, from the library, wherever. So each player's going to flip that top card over. It becomes a 2/2. Now, the fun part here is if it is a non-creature card, that card is stuck being a face down 2/2 the rest of the game. Whereas if it's a creature, they can pay the mana cost and flip it face up at any time. Your deck, however, has the advantage of being able to flip things over with Coust and some of these other things. So if you have a permanent like an artifact or an enchantment, you can flip it over and keep that permanent on the board, and it's kind of fun like that. Next up, we have an artifact that'll actually let you have a free disguise or morph card for a turn. It's Panoptic Projector. For 4 mana. It's an artifact that says tap. The next face down creature spell you cast this turn costs 3 less to cast. And if turning a face down permanent face up causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers an additional time. So it also has kind of a Panharmonicon-like trigger ability attached to creatures being turned face up. So it's got some functionality here to give us multiple triggers if something says, draw a card or do multiple things. Like, say, example, Experiment 12. putting counters on things, it would trigger twice. So then you get the counters once, and then you get the counters again. And then if you have no mana left, or you need to do something like that, where you want to have an additional morph on the board, well, then you can just tap this and you get basically one free morph for the turn, because you don't have to pay the 3 mana into it to put it face down on the board. Then, like all of the other precons, we have a copy of Ransom Note in here. 1 colorless, surveil 1 when it enters the battlefield, pay 2 and sack it, choose 1, cloak the top card of your library, which is probably the most important thing for this particular deck, goad target creature, or draw a card. Most likely you're not going to use the goad functionality in this particular deck. You're probably going to cloak the top card, so you're able to go ahead and get an additional morph creature on the board. And then you also can just draw a card straight up if you want to have that extra card at any time. Then we have a couple of enchantments that work really well with the theme of this deck. First up is True Identity. For 1 and a white, you get an enchantment that says whenever it or another permanent you control is turned face up, scry 1, then draw a card. This ability only triggers once a turn. So this actually can be played face down as a 2/2 creature because it has a disguise cost of a white. So if you need a creature, or you want to hide this, or use it, you can even use this to like draw removal spells out of your opponent's hands. You can flip this up in response to a removal spell, and it no longer has a proper target if it says destroy target creature. Now, bear in mind, if it says exile target permanent or remove target permanent, well, you're still screwed either way. But in the case of this, it's good for that. It's also good if they do like a board wipe or something like that, or they go, you know, farewell and they don't name enchantments. Well, if you do that and you flip this up, well, it's an enchantment, and then it doesn't get removed with the farewell. The other enchantment I mentioned here is much more powerful, and that is Veiled Ascension. For 3 and a white, it's an enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, put a flying counter on each face-down creature you control. Face-down creatures you control enter the battlefield with a flying counter on them, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may cloak the top card of your library. So obviously 2/2s are not going to do great in a lot of combat situations, especially in Commander, because, you know, we're dealing with creatures that are huge. So we need to give them any kind of advantage we can give them, and Veiled Ascension gives them the ability to evade being blocked, so you can get them through, then flip them over and do even more damage. And it makes it so you can go ahead and get more things on the board because you're able to cloak the top card of your library every turn. And again, even if that creature did not start out having Disguise or Morph, as long as it's a creature card, when you put it on the board off with the cloaking, you can flip it up and turn it back into a creature at any time. And again, we also have the ability with Coust and a few of the other spells to flip over permanents. So even if it's an enchantment or an artifact, planeswalker, whatever, we can still flip them back over using those other methods and get to keep them on the board for the rest of the game. And the last new card that we're getting here is actually a land. We didn't get too many of these in the precons that were different from everything else. And that is Branch of Vitu-Ghazi. It's a land that taps for a colorless, but it plays as a disguise 3, and it says when it is turned face up, add 2 mana of any one color until end of turn. You don't lose the mana as the steps and phases end. So I love flexible lands like this. This is great because if we don't need the mana for this, then it's nice to have the ability just to flop this down on the board as a 2/2, which helps us hide our creatures from each other. Now, one thing I did not mention earlier in this is with the different face down creature types that we have now between morphs and disguised creatures, we have to declare what these things are now to our opponent. So if an opponent knows what these are, we have to actually know what we're messing with. So if something has disguise, because it has ward 2 on a disguised or cloaked creature, we have to declare that, yes, this is a creature that has been cloaked or has been disguised. We have to declare that this is a morphed or a manifested creature, because they are completely separate abilities and they have different things that they do. And it matters because the ward will counter their spells if they try to kill a disguised creature versus trying to directly kill one of your morphs instead. But this is a nice way to kind of hide among your disguised creatures an additional creature, so it kind of helps with the shell game of your creatures that you can do a little bit of without them knowing what the creatures are. So with all that said, what are we removing from this deck? Well, let's start off with one of the new cards that I did not actually talk about when we were talking about the new cards, and that is Tisak, Judith's Hellhound. For 3 and a red, you get a 3/3 elemental dog with Unleash. Other dogs you control have Unleash. Creatures you have with counters on them have haste, and whenever it attacks, add a red for each attacking creature. Now this is, a fine card in and of itself, but it doesn't really help with our plan of flipping cards up and doing special effects with them. And all of the other dog cards that were in the original Precon, which we'll talk about in a little bit, have been removed as part of this because we don't have any reason to keep them in, and I'll explain why shortly. So this card is probably better suited something for like a Rin and Seri inseparable deck or something of that variety. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it out of this particular build. There's also a couple other cards that just don't fit what I want to do with the deck, and that is Scourge of the Throne and Wild Growth. Both of them are great cards in and of themselves. They do good things, but I don't want them in here because I want to make room for more Ravnica flavored stuff. So that's why they've been cut out. Everything else that's been cut out, there's more of reason to cut them out because they don't belong in this world because of various reasons. Let's start off with where I talked about where I cut some of the dogs out of the deck. So we have things like Anok Survivalist and Salt Road Ambushers. They redone the creature types on these. They're no longer hounds like they were back in the original printing. They are dogs. These are creature types that don't show up on Ravnica, though. There are not dog warriors, and the Anok is a specific tribe that belonged on the plane of Tarkir, so I'm going to leave them out. The Nantukos don't belong here either, with Broodhatch and Nantuko Vigilante, so these cards just don't belong in the deck, so I'm going to go ahead and take them out. And then I'm also taking out Master of Pearls because there's not monks on the plane of Ravnica, and Death Mist Raptor because as far as I can tell and everything I've read up on, dinosaurs do not have any place on Ravnica either, even though it is a really good morph card. The next batch of removals that's coming out of the deck, though, they are all named legends or name drop legends in the names of the spells. We're talking about Achroma, Angel of Fury, Neheb the Eternal, Sereth the Viper's Fang, Cedar Kondo of Jamura, Toski Bearer of Secrets, Eudora Gravegardener, Jessica's Will, Return of the Wild Speaker, and Ugin's Mastery. If you haven't seen any of the other Precon upgrades for these Ravnica Precons, you're going to know that I take out anything that does not belong to the plane of Ravnica, and that includes all these named legends, and I punt them out of the deck to make room for more Ravnica-based cards. And then the last batch of stuff that I'm removing here, also in the same spirit as the last ones, is things that name drop parts of the world or groups or individuals that are not those legends but mention them in the name, such as Corrosion Cloud Scraper and Corrosion Colossus. Both of these come from the world area of Krosa, the forest that's on Otaria, which happens to be on Dominaria. We also have Oron Frostfang, which is actually part of where Tessiere used to be in Dominaria, so that's coming out. Sakura Tribe Elder. The Sakura Tribe were the snake people of Kamigawa in the old times, so those are coming out. Temur War Shaman is one of the tribes that belong on the world of Tarkir, so this is coming out. And then Thelanite Hermit is a group that worships the Thelan of Havenwood, which is a legend that came from Dominaria and created the Thalids. And then the last card we're going to remove is Life Crafter's Bestiary. Now, a Life Crafter is actually like a title for somebody who lives on the world of Kaladesh, who deals with crafting these automatons into living beings, or they reflect the life of that plane as an automaton. So we're going to go ahead and take this out as well. So with all these cards coming out, what are we going to do to fill the deck back in with Ravnica based cards? Well, let's start off with a big chunk of stuff coming from the brand new set, starting with Aurelia's Vindicator for 2 white for 2 Angel with Disguise, and then it also has Flying Lifelink and Ward 2 on its front side. And if you flip it up for its disguise cost of X3 and a white, you can exile up to X other target creatures from the battlefield and or creature cards from graveyards, and when it leaves the battlefield, those cards go back to their owner's hands. So it's a great way to use a disguise card to either remove things to get them out of your way, or to get things back out of your graveyard so that when this thing finally dies or you run it into something, you can go ahead and get those things back to your hand. And speaking of ways to get things back into our hand, we're also going to use another new disguise card, Forum Familiar, for a white. It's a cat. It's just a 1/1, nothing really special here, but it has a disguise cost of 1 and a white. And when Forum Familiar is turned face up, return another target permanent you control to its owner's hand and put a +1/+1 counter on the Forum Familiar. So what makes this so special is that the fact that if once you flip up a disguise card or a morph that has a special trigger on it, you really can't do much else with it. Well, in this case, you flip the Forum Familiar over, you bounce that other creature back to your hand, and then you can go ahead and replay it face down again, and then reactivate its Disguise or Megamorph or whatever cost it happens to have, and then you get that trigger once again. And since we're on the topic of triggers, let's talk about Pyrotechnic Performer. For 1 and a red, it's a 3/2 Viashino Assassin with a disguise cost of a red, and whenever it or another creature you control is turned face up, that creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. This can be very powerful when most of the creatures in the deck, of which I believe there's about 29 or so, that have a flip trigger kind of thing going on, that does something. Well, when they all can flip up and blast things on our opponents, and then you couple that with things that double that trigger, like the Panoptic Projector, this can get really powerful really quick, so it's a great addition to the deck. We're also going to add Unyielding Gatekeeper for 1 and a white to 3/2 Elephant Cleric with a disguise cost of 1 and a white. Whenever it is turned face up, exile another target non-land permanent. If you controlled it, it returns to the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, its controller creates a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. So what this does for us is, if we want to have a quick way to flip over a creature and we don't care about any kind of flip triggers, we can exile one of our creatures, blink it back in, and it'll come back in face up. And then on top of that, if we need a quick removal spell for like some really nasty threat like an Eldrazi or a big dragon or something, we can just flip this up, exile it, and your 8/8 dragon or whatever turns into a 2/2 detective with really no other abilities. And then since we took out the Nanchuko Vigilante, I'm going to go ahead and add back in Vengeful Creeper for 4 and a green. It's a 5/5 plant elemental with disguise, 5 and a green. When it is turned face up, destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. Now this does cost more to flip back up, but the advantage here is that it has ward 2, so it's harder to get rid of before you can get it flipped back up on its face. And it also has a much bigger body than the Nanchuko has, and it fits the world of Ravnica for us. Then to get another good body in here, we got Crowd Control Warden for 3, a green and a white. You get a 4/4 Centaur Soldier that says, as it enters the battlefield or is turned face up, put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of other creatures you control, and it disguises for 3 and 2 hybrid Selesnya. So this gives us a few options. We can play it early as a morph to attack with or block with or whatever, or to get other types of things going on, and then later on flip it back up. Or if we draw it late game, we can just slam it down for 5 and have a pretty good sized body on our hands to start slamming in towards our opponents. Either way, I thought it merited a good slot here in the deck. And then the last of the disguise cards that we're going to add here is Dog Walker. For a red-white, you get a 3/1 human citizen with vigilance, and then a disguise of 2 hybrid Boros. When Dog Walker is turned face up, create 2 tapped 1/1 white dog creature tokens. So this is a good early threat if you want to go that route and go aggressive, but the good play here is to pay the 5 mana over a couple of turns, flip this over, and you get 5 power spread out over the 3 bodies. And you're able to manipulate that and do things, get your extra triggers off of things. Like, you get 4 dogs if you have the Panoptic Projector out. So there's some good things going on here. I thought this one merited a good inclusion as well, just to fill in some slots that got knocked out of the deck when we took it apart. Next, let's take a look at a couple of cards that actually benefit from when the face down permanents are flipped up, or at least help our face down permanents. And first up is Sumala Sentry for a green-white. It's an elf archer, 1/3 with reach. And it says, whenever a face-down permanent you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on the creature that was turned face up, and a +1/+1 counter on Sumala Sentry. So while this is out, every creature we flip up makes this thing bigger, and it makes our other creatures that are getting flipped up 1 power bigger. So this is a good way just to give us a little mini buff and help push the deck along. In that same vein, we have the much more powerful Yaris, Roar of the Old Gods. For 2, a red and a green, you get a 4/4 Centaur Druid. Other creatures you control have haste, so all of our morphs will have haste for the game. And whenever 1 or more face-down creatures you control deal combat damage, draw a card. So, you smack combat damage onto your opponents, you get cards, because if they don't block them, they're gonna pay for it, and you're gonna get the cards off of it. And whenever a face-down creature you control dies, returns to the battlefield face down under its owner's control if it's a permanent card, and then turn it face up. So this has a couple of interesting effects attached to it. First off, it keeps our disguised creatures, morph creatures, cloaked creatures, all that stuff is going to be hitting, and if they block it, we go ahead and get it back anyways. And if it was a creature or a permanent of any sort, it flips back up. Now that also means any kind of manifested or cloaked artifacts and enchantments, planeswalkers, whatever, they got put down with some of our other spells in the deck. If they go into combat and they die, then they're going to flip back up when they come back in, and you get to keep them, and you don't even have to pay for the cost. The only disadvantage here is you don't get any kind of triggered effect that was paid for, like on the Aurelia's Vindicator or anything like that. And since this deck has so many ways of putting disguised creatures onto the board, let's play Expose the Culprit. For 1 and a red, it's an instant. Choose one or both. Turn target face down, creature face up, so you get a free shot at flipping up one of your creatures. Or exile any number of face up creatures you control with disguise and put them in a face down pile, shuffle the pile, and then cloak them. So the nice part here is if you have, 3 or 4 creatures that you've already flipped up with either Coust, or you've used their disguise ability to flip them up and you've already burned them up, you can then exile them, shuffle them up, so your opponents don't know which creatures are which on the board, rather than just flip them up and then know which one to blow up later. And then you get to put them back down and they're back in their face down state, so then you can pay to flip them back up or use Coust to flip them back up and gain more benefits for flipping the creatures back over. I'm also going to include Hide in Plain Sight. For 3 and a green. It's a sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library and cloak 2 of them. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this way you get to look and see, okay, I have, a couple creatures I want to have, or maybe there's an enchantment you really would like, and you have ways of trying to get them on the board to flip them up. If you have other ways of flipping them, like those enchantments and those artifacts, you can put those down and flip them over using those methods, and then you get to keep them anyways. And then, or you just want a special utility off of a creature, you get it and just put it down on the board. And maybe you just need the bodies, you can put them down on the board, and there you go. Either way, this is a pretty good card in this particular deck. And still in the new set, let's look at Assemble the Players. For 1 and a white, it's an enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. Once each turn, you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. Now, the fun part here is you can actually cast morphs and disguise creatures as their 2/2 selves off the top of your stuff. So you can go ahead and cast a morph face down off the top of your deck with Assemble the Players. So that's a really good interaction to have in this deck. And then on top of that, it also helps you to figure out, okay, do I have something on top with like the manifesting spells or whatever? So you know what you're going to have going on if you need to manifest or cloak something off the top of your deck, rather than kind of blindly going into it. Then we're going to use an enchantment that I actually used in the Deep Clue Sea upgrades, and that is Buried in the Garden. For 2, a green and a white, you get an aura that enchants a land, and when it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent you don't control until it leaves the battlefield, and whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana, it adds an additional 1 mana of any color. So aside from the color fixing that this offers, it also gives us a way to remove stuff in the deck and still keep with our Ravnica themes, and it can hit any permanent, not just creatures, so it has a lot of versatility for us as well. Murders at Karlov Manor also gives us Connecting the Dots. For 1 and a red, it's an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. Pay 1 and a red, discard your hand, and sacrifice Connecting the Dots to put all the exiled cards into your owner's hands. So since we lost a few of the card draw mechanics in the deck when I took out some of the other legends and whatnot out of there, I thought I'd add something back in the form of Connecting the Dots, because eventually you're going to burn your hand out, and then if you've been doing this enough times, you're going to be able to refill your hand pretty quickly with this. For the rest of the deck, we're going to fill in the blanks with some older Ravnica cards. Let's start with Night of Autumn. For 1, a green and a white, 2/1 Dryad Knight. Enters the battlefield, choose 1, put 2 counters on it, destroy target artifact or enchantment, or you gain 4 life. So I love the modality of this. It's great to give ourselves some options in case we need it. If we need a bigger body, we can do that. If we need to blow up something, we have that option. Or if we need to pad our life totals, we have that option too. And it's nice because if it gets put on a manifest or a cloaking on the board, we can still turn it up face up and get something out of it. It also makes a good blinking target for Unyielding Gatekeeper. So just remember, if you cloak it and flip it, you don't get the ETB trigger because it was already on the board. But if you're able to blink it, then you do. And since the Precon actually included a copy of Imperial Hellkite, which has a morph when it flips up, you get to search for a dragon in your deck. I wanted to add some dragons back into the deck and make it so you could actually do things. So we're going to take a look at 2 dragons that I put in here. So first up, we're going to look at Utvara Hellkite. This came in Return to Ravnica. For 6 red. It's a dragon 6/6 flyer. And whenever a dragon attacks, you get a 6/6 red dragon creature token with flying on the battlefield. And we're also going to put the brand new Incinerator of the Guilty in this deck. For 4 red. It's a 6/6 dragon with flying and trample. It says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can collect evidence X, and when you do, it deals X damage to each creature and planeswalker the player controlled that it dealt damage to. Both of these make great targets for the Imperial Hellkite to go get out of the deck, and if you have the Panoptic Projector online when you do it, you can get them both if you don't already have them in hand, so that's a nice little trick there. Then we're going to add a little bit of protection for our little 2/2 creatures and whatnot in the deck in the form of Unbreakable Formation, 2 and a white. Instant, creatures you control gain indestructible, with the addendum of if you cast it during your main phase, put a +1/+1 counter on each of those creatures. They gain vigilance until end of turn. And Join Shields for 3, a green and a white. Untap all creatures you control. They gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Now, I know there are better protection spells than Join Shields, but I've been wanting to use this in a deck, and I thought this would be a nice place to kind of go ahead and put it in. And in Unbreakable Formation, we've used this before. Now, there's something about Unbreakable where you do have to remember, if you're using Duskana, the Rage Mother, you're going to wreck her trigger using the addendum version of this spell. So you may want to just sit on it as a response on your opponent's turns rather than pumping your stuff, unless you are trying to just finish somebody off in a, critter hoof overrun type of situation. I also came across an interesting split card from one of the old sets, and I thought it was fun. Armed and Dangerous. The armed side, for 1 and a red, you get a sorcery. Target creature gets +1/+1 and gains double strike until end of turn. And then the more important side here, Dangerous, for 3 and a green. All creatures able to block target creature this turn do so. If we're trying to finish an opponent off and we're trying to punch on through, this probably works a little better with Duskana because you're able to, turn one of your creatures into you have to block this, and all the 2/2s are able to get through, and then they get pumped with Duskana's trigger. But either way, this makes for a great way to just finish the game off by forcing all of an opponent's blockers into one attacker, and everything else gets through and smashes their face. Another way for our attackers to get through and finish the game is Bond of Discipline. For 4 and a white, you get a sorcery. Tap all creatures your opponents control. Creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. So if we're able to finish off an opponent by tapping down all of their stuff, attacking through and gaining a bunch of life to pad our life total for another opponent to deal with, then that just works out great for us. I also wanted to include a copy of a spell that uses an ability that's kind of trashed upon. This is Bright Flame for X red, red, white, white. It's a sorcery that deals X damage to target creature and each other creature that shares a color with it, and you gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. So the cool part about the morphs and the disguised creatures and whatnot, they're colorless. They don't have a color. So as long as they're not flipped up on their front side, you can go ahead and bright flame somebody's stuff. And even if they are playing the same color as you are, those creatures are not going to die to the bright flame, but maybe all of theirs are, especially if they're in a monocolor deck. So I thought this would be a great time to break out the Radiance mechanic that was all the way back in the original Ravnica set. Also coming from the original Ravnica set is Cloudstone Curio for 3 colorless. It's an artifact that says whenever a non-artifact permanent enters the battlefield under your control, you may return another permanent you control that shares a permanent type with it to its owner's hand. So this is a fun one here, because just like the Forum Familiar, we're able to bounce our stuff back to our hands as we're casting more morphs. So if you do a morph or a disguised creature and get it flipped up on its front side, but want to reuse the ability, play another morph, bounce the original one back to your hand, and then you're able to recast it on its morph side again and bounce something else back up, and you just keep chain bouncing your morphs back to your hand over and over and over again. It's a great card, and it always has been, and it gets a lot of work here with how I set this up in the build. And then the last couple cards we're going to add here are actually mana dorks. First up is Paradise Druid from one of the last sets we had in Ravnica. 1 and a green, 2/1 elf druid. It says it has hexproof as long as it's untapped, and it taps to add mana of any one color. Just a great all-around mana dork. And we also have a new one. I forgot about this guy until just a little bit ago. It's Tunnel Tipster. For 1 and a green, you get a 1/1 that taps for a green, and it also has at the beginning of your end step, if a face-down creature entered the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on the Tunnel Tipster. So not only do we get a basic mana dork out of this, we also get one that can grow as we keep playing our disguised creatures and our morph creatures face down. Things get manifested, just all kinds of stuff going on. This will actually get bigger as the game goes. So that was my version of the Deadly Disguise Precon upgraded to Thematic Upgrades based in Ravnica cards. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Was there something I should have added, should not have added, forgot about, whatever? Let me know down there. Of the 4 Precons, since this is the last video, I would say the most interesting of the Precons is the Blame Game Precon, just because it does something differently than any of the other Precons out of this whole set, and that makes it just kind of special. You get to do red-white, usually the equipment, aggro, beat everybody up type stuff, and you get to play kind of a sort of group hug deck for the most part. You sit back and you let the game come to you rather than going after your opponents all the time, which is what Boros usually does. And you're able to, goad your opponent's creatures, let them beat each other up, force them to attack each other, and then you sweep in with your creatures and clean up. So, if you're going to go with any of these and you're wanting something slightly different than the norm, the Blame Game deck is probably the one I would go with. Outside of that, I do like the Deadly Disguise deck. It was the hardest one to upgrade, but if you don't mess around with these Ravnica only upgrades, then you have a lot more flexibility, more morphs available, more other creatures. There were some creatures I was going to go ahead and sneak in here to bulk up the creature count, but then I was like, I can't do that because then I'm breaking the Ravnica only theme I have on all these precons. So if you feel like you want to do that, then feel free to go ahead and do that. There's all kinds of avenues you can take to upgrade these decks. I like all four of these decks. I can't wait to get my hands on one of them to really go ahead and tweak one for my own uses. And I love this. I love Ravnica. This is just a great world to come back to every time. And I can't wait to see what comes in the future. For now, if you like what I'm doing here, please feel free to subscribe, like, comment. It helps the channel grow. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day.